So, coming to our first talk, it's my great pleasure to introduce Peter Dayan. He doesn't really need an introduction, I think, but he's the fact scientist for Biological Cybernetics Director in Tübingen. And before coming to Tübingen in 2019, he was the director of the Computational Neuroscience Unit in London. And he has really broad range of work, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's all related to reinforcement learning. It's more for me. Okay, and yeah, so he will today talk about some work in the direction of computational psychiatry, and that's basically about theoretical approaches to anxiety, depression, and yeah, I will bore you too much. So without further ado,
thank you very much indeed. Thanks so much to the organisers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Indeed, the talk is about risk, but the biggest risk is that you don't ask any questions. So please do interrupt me. I want it to be a nice interactive session. Doesn't matter if I don't get through all my slides, so please do, as I said, interrupt. So this is joint work with a number of people, including Chris Gagby, who was a postdoc in my lab, and now is in a company called Human.ai in America, and Yannick Stryker, who's a research assistant and a master's student at Tübingen. Okay, so this is a map of Tübingen that Toby is going to take you through shortly. I'm not quite true, but so imagine you're in control of this agent here in a world. I guess you've got a bit light, can't see, but well, hopefully you can see that there are these walls around here. There are what Chris loves to call lava pits here. There's a treasure chest here. That's what you'll find. That's the prize at the end of the Symphony's trip. And the rules of the game are you get to move. Like you move north, south, east, or west. Of course, if you move your wall, then nothing happens. But your moves are inaccurate with probably 12.5%. So 1/8. You try to move north, and you have some chance of just moving in a random direction. We have a discount factor, which means that future rewards are discounted relative to the present, so they're worth a little bit less. That's to make you hurry up. And then if you get to the reward, you get 5. If you get gobbled up by the lava, you get -10. Okay, so show of hands. So there are sort of 3 sort of obvious routes here. There's this route like this. There's which takes you very close to a lot of lava. There's this route like this, which takes you closer into this lava. And there's this route like this, all the way around here. Okay, so hands up, who would take the fairly direct route? That means who would take the intermediate route? Two more. And who would take this route? Okay. Excellent. Okay, good. So now you already know how risk-seeking and risk-averse your friends are. So that's good for working out your thing. So I was very surprised. It's one of these things where you can't imagine that everybody else would do something differently from yourself. So what this shows, if you can see it, is 6 people who sadly are anonymous in my lab, of 6 or 7 people in a pilot we did, whereby you can see that a couple of them took this direct route, more of them, maybe like 3 or 4, took this intermediate route, and then you can also see the effect of the randomness which happens here. So what we'd like to understand is, presumably the reason you would take these different routes is you're worried about risk, right? And also what's important is that risk sort of accumulates, right? You think, oh, I'm going on this route, I keep on going here, I'm getting close to this lava pit, and I go down there, close to these lava pits too. So if you're worried about risk, or then you might think, well, how is it that I can compute what route I should do under the circumstances that if I take this route, I've sort of committed myself to the chance of being gobbled up by this awful lava pit. Okay, and then risk is important from a psychiatric perspective because, of course, there are conditions like anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, a number of conditions where people are obsessive, but OCD as well, where people are really worried about aspects of risk. So I'm going to talk about risk aversion and then talk about a way of formalizing that, which really comes from the insurance industry, which, of course, has been thinking about risk in a very quantitative terms for a long time. And the way of formalizing it is something called the conditional value at risk. And I'll talk about what that is and why that's a good way of measuring things. It turns out there are a couple of different variants of that. One called, we'll see, called pre-committed CVAR, and another called nested CVAR. I'll explain why the difference and why they're important. We'll talk then about risk-averse online behavior. That's like the choices you were making as you were looking at my Chris's or Yannick's maze. And then we'll talk about risk-averse offline planning. That leads to the replay elimination. So one thing you might do is if you're in an environment where there are uncertainties and risks, you might plan ahead of time what to do in order to mitigate those risks. We'll talk a bit about what that might look like in some simple case, and try and relate that to replay, which is this phenomenon in the hippocampus where we know that during periods of quiet wakefulness or sleep, people, the hippocampus and the cortex are coordinated to reactivate patterns of activity, which might be involved in some sort of offline planning, at least if that's the argument. Okay, and as Tony said, the context of this is computational psychiatry, which is sort of this nascent field. Well, what we're trying to do is to use the flaws of decision-making largely to think about some of the things that can go wrong in the context of psychiatric disorder. So in psychiatry, people are often making decisions that either they or society wish they didn't make. And so we would like to understand something about what the roots of those problems are. And because we have a lot of work thinking about decision-making as a whole, and reinforcement learning, for instance, then it means that we can try to understand some of the causes, the underlying mechanisms that might go wrong in computational psychiatry. And so for me, there are various ways to sort of to use this mechanism to understand what could happen. So one thing I like to do is to split it up in the following way. So here you can imagine here that the flesh is willing, but the spirit is weak. What I mean by here is you can imagine somebody essentially solving what amounts to the wrong problem. So think of something like anhedonic depression, in which the outcomes that normally, under normal circumstances, would have value to you, lose their value. You can think of it in that case, even if you're planning correctly, so you're doing all the right things, if things don't have that value, then the choices you're going to make are going to be very different from the choices that other people would make, or that maybe you would make in other circumstances. A second possibility is the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. So here, what you're trying to do is solve the correct problem. So you have the same outcomes and still valuable, you have the same correct prize about the world, but the mechanisms that you bring to bear trying to solve those problems are inadequate to the task that it faces. And so that, again, will lead to decisions which will lead to behavior which looks abnormal in some way or the other. So you can get the same sort of abnormal behavior for two completely different reasons. And of course, in psychiatry, we'd like to understand how and why, so that we can then, for instance, try to think about what the prognosis might be, or think about what sort of treatment you might possibly have. The third answer is the third possibility, of course, is the flesh is weak and the spirit is weak, that we call Brexit. But a more interesting one is, I think, also important, which is where you're trying to solve the correct problem, but you've adapted to an environment which doesn't afford the normal opportunities. So here, for instance, here's this sort of desert environment where the opportunities are essentially not present. So you can imagine that maybe the environment has changed from this desert to this lush rainforest. But essentially, because you've adapted yourself to this bad environment, you no longer have an incentive to try and explore, just because you don't think there's anything worth exploiting. The environment has subsequently changed, such that actually the behavior that you should have should change itself. Then you need to change your behavior. And again, this is an example of something where you could get behavior which actually comes from essentially what amounts to sort of correct assumptions about correct problem solved correctly, but with an environmental mismatch. And in psychiatry, there are a lot of what I think of as being path dependencies. So this is cases where there's something you pick up on in an environment at one point in your life, for instance. In child psychiatry, it's very clear in that way. But then that has really big consequences in the future for what you expect should work in an environment and what you should do. So we're agents who are responsible for gaining our own information. Right? We have to actively explore. We don't have this information just delivered to us. And so your choice about exploration depends on what you expect the world to be, to afford. And so if you don't think it affords very much, then you won't explore and find out that it's changed. Okay, so that's general complex psychiatry. Now let's think a bit about risk. So risk is a very critical aspect of all sorts of decision making, right? So often there's some chance that something could go wrong, typically it involves decision making where there's some sort of uncertain outcomes, so probabilistic outcomes that could be good or could be bad. And this is this is Lloyd's of London. So whole industries are designed around mitigating risk essentially, and that's why we have these good ideas. As I said, it plays a role, crucial role in many aspects of psychopathology, so anxiety, mania. And indeed, one of the interesting things when it comes to replay, if I get the chance at the end, is that people have these sort of ruminations, ruminative what ifs. What if I hadn't, I got run over? What if if my coffee had been colder in the morning? I'd have drunk it faster, and then I wouldn't have been there when the car was there. We can generate, we're smart, we can generate many different sorts of what ifs, which are going to essentially change the possible alterations to our planning processes that would then avoid some problems. But the trouble is this can sort of never end. Like as I said, we're smart. We can generate ever more elaborate what ifs, the problems that might happen and ways of solving it without an end. And people get stuck in these aspects of rumination. Okay, so what sort of risk measure should we adopt? So a very handy one, I think, which really relates nicely to what we might worry about, is to think about the distribution of possible outcomes. So here's here are the returns you could have. Here's some density of what those returns are. And then what we worry about are the nastiest things that can happen, right? So those are the things, those are the outcomes that happen on the lower tail of this distribution, right? So obviously distributions have means, they have variances. So some people think about risk in terms of variance. But if you think about variance includes both upside risk and downside risk. So the nicest things that can happen unexpectedly and the nastiest things. But when we worry about risk, I think we generally are going to worry about the nastiest things rather than the nicest ones. So we'd like to have some way of focusing on that lower tail of the distribution. So the risk measure that we get at from insurance for this is called the conditional value of risk. So let me explain that. So here again is a distribution of outcomes with some probabilities. So returns are -4 up to +3 with these probabilities, just showing this in this regard. So normally in reinforcement learning, we think about the average return. That's just the mean of this distribution, which here is just slightly skewed less than 0, just a little bit less than 0. But if we worry about lower tails, what we might like to do is to slice off this bottom of the distribution and then worry about that lower tail. So one thing you might be very familiar with is just a quantile. I think so. In fact, here this shows the lower 30% of this distribution. That's called the lower. We call that the 0.3 quantile of this distribution, just shown here. So indeed, some people use as a risk measure the value here, which is this lower quantile. You can see it's lower than the mean correctly because it's just a little bit lower than the mean because we're looking at the bottom bit. It turns out that's not a good risk measure. It doesn't have properties you would like risk measures to have, so axiomatic properties like when you lay off risk, when you distribute your outcomes, you can then if you have like 2 options, and then you would like to say that the risk associated with the combination of them can be less than the risk of the individual one. But a measure which still focuses on this lower tail, is called the conditional value of risk, which is just the average value in this lower tail. Right, so you can show that this value is just shown here. In this case, it's about -2. So we're slicing off the distribution, and we're taking the average value of that lower tail. And that clearly focuses on all the nastiest things that can happen. So here, what I've shown you is what happens is we have a ever more extreme risk preference. So we're risk neutral. We think take the whole distribution shown by this darker blue. Then as we edit more and more of the distribution by saying we focus on a lower and lower tail, then we are getting rid of these light blue things, and now we're just focusing here. And so you can see this nice monotonic or nasty monotonic decrease in the value associated with this excess risk aversion that you have. So here you're very risk averse if you just worry about these modern things. You can imagine if you're in the context of anxiety, essentially this is like a preference. You just get to choose which aspect of the world you worry about. I can tell you that this is the wrong risk level to worry about. It's something which essentially is your almost like it's like a personal preference. And so that then shows the effect of if you happen to have this low preference, then you can see that the way that you would evaluate this set of returns is very much worse than if you have a risk neutrality. And you could even be risk seeking and then instead of worrying about the lower tail, you could worry about the upper tail. So the most, we didn't in Yannick and Chris's domains, we didn't invite you to be risk seeking, but I'm sure there are some of you who chose the risky path would choose an even more risk seeking path. And so then you're probably thinking about the upper tail rather than the lower tail. Another way, that's just for the definition. Another way of thinking about it is we're taking this whole distribution. Those who know about prospect theory, which is an idea from behavioral economics, there, what you might be familiar with is the idea that you take a distribution of outcomes and you edit, you change the probabilities to say that some outcomes are more likely than they really are. And you can think of this as being, another way, a sort of dual way of reporting the C-bar is to say that I'm going to put I have a weighting function called this psi function. And that psi function puts essentially 0 weight on all these likely guys, and then puts as much weight as it can up to a constraint on the nastiest things that can happen. And that constraint comes from how risk averse you are. So typically, if your risk aversion is 0.3, then the maximum you can increase the weight is by 1 over 0.3, so 3 1/3. So you increase the probability of all the nastiest things by 3 1/3 until you run out of probability, because the whole thing still has to add up to 1. And this is just a completely equivalent way of doing what we're doing here, just editing this distribution to focus on these lower nasty tails. Okay, so just to sum up on C-bar, it's what's called a coherent risk measure. And that's this idea that there are risk measures which satisfy some nice axiomatic properties. That's why they like it in insurance. That's why we're going to, one reason we might look at it. It emphasizes the lower tail, as we've argued. If alpha is 1, you care about just the regular mean. As alpha tends to 0, you only care about the worst possible outcome. And we'll see that that actually has an interesting link to things like learned helplessness, which is one of the phenomena in depression, we'll talk about later. And this dual equivalence is to this probability distortion, which is what you see in prospect theory, as I mentioned as well, favoring bad outcomes. Any questions on C-bar? Okay, or you think it's too dangerous to ask? Okay, so usually when people ask, interrogate this, things like prospect, they do it in this sort of case here. It's a bit difficult to see. So it's basically one-shot problems. So here, the example is that you have you have 2 options: go left or go right. If you go left, you're playing it safe. You get a small reward here worth 10 units. If you go right, you're taking a risk where you have some probability of getting nothing or probability of winning a large amount. And so here you can see that the color in this particular experiment, the color of the circle tells you the chance of getting the large amount, so 10% up to 90%. So you can imagine a whole variety of tests like this. But these one-shot problems are not the sorts of problems that we are normally dealing with. Instead, we worry about these sorts of problems often, where you make a sequence of whole decisions, and then you have to worry about how is risk accumulating or potentially accumulating, or how does risk operate when you have to make not only one choice, but a whole sequence of choices between the start and the goal. And that, I think, better describes most of the cases that we're generally interested in. And it turns out that risk is complicated in those cases for a reason that we'll just see. So to illustrate that, I'm going to take the simplest case of a sequential choice, where you just have like 2 steps, essentially. In fact, you don't even have a choice at all. I'm just going to ask, how would you evaluate risk in this case if you didn't have a choice? And then, of course, if we evaluate it correctly, then you can choose the one which has the best value under your risk aversion. So here's a very simple tree where we have a start state and we have 2 possible outcomes. So they're like a set of bad outcomes and a set of good outcomes. Bad outcomes, so this state you get to with probably 10%, and this state you get to with 90%. And if you get to this state, you get a sample from this distribution. All of these values are less than 0. If you get to this state, a good state, then all the values are greater than 0. But again, you get a chance of an outcome which comes from this distribution here. And the question that you should ask yourselves is, well, now, if I'm at the start state, what distribution of outcomes do I have? And how do I evaluate it if I care about risk? Well, the distribution is easy to write down. It's just shown here, where you have this is now down weighted. Why is this so low? Yeah.
It's multiplied by 0.1.
Exactly. So here, all the outcomes. These ones are only happen 10% of the time. So just you say they're multiplied by 0.1, and these ones are high because they're multiplied by 0.9. So if we care about C-bar, right, this condition value of risk, what I told you should do, let's say we're going to think about the 10% chance. What you should do is to look at this whole distribution of outcomes and then only think about the bottom 10%, right? That's the prescription in our C-bar. And so here, the bottom 10%, conveniently, are just only these outcomes. So there's no overlap between these 2 distributions. So that's shown by this blue blob here. which means that the C-var value here is actually the average value of these guys, which is whatever it is, just a little bit less than like -1.5 or something like that. But if you think about the sequence problem, so now imagine that you've taken, we now have this weighted probability process, right? Where we say we can have an enhanced probability of getting nasty outcomes and a high probability of getting nice outcomes. So here, it turns out that if we're thinking about it, the probability of getting a nice outcome goes to 0 because we don't care about any of these outcomes at all, which means the probability of getting the nasty outcomes goes to 1. Like all the outcomes we worry about are these nasty outcomes. But now what do we do? If you think about it now, we arrive at this nasty set of nasty outcomes. And if you want to evaluate the C-var correctly from the perspective of the start state, we now have to say, well, every single one of these outcomes contributes to this average here. Right? So you might think, well, what I should do is just only look at the bottom 10% of these outcomes too, right? Because I'm now I care about the lower 10. But if I want to be consistent with the way that I make a choice here with respect to this start state, then in fact I have to include all of these outcomes in my calculation. That's why the C-var value here is -1.5. And so that means I have to change the value of the risk that I care about when I get to this, if I get to this bad outcome. I now have to re-weight it such that in fact all of them become part of my consideration. I think not just the lower tail of these outcomes. I have to think about every single possible outcome in this group. And so there's what you might think of as being a sort of justified gambler's fallacy. So here, in the gambler's fallacy, if you're unlucky in one toss of the dice, you think, well, next time I'll be lucky because I've already consumed all my bad luck. And that's exactly what happens here. So here you're right about the risk. You think, well, now if the bad thing happens, I'm now following this nasty outcome here. I've consumed all my bad luck on this path. And so now I can afford to be more risk-seeking, or at least more risk-neutral with respect to the outcomes that come here. So this way of thinking about the start state, worrying about things from the perspective of the start state, tells you you have to worry about revaluing your risk as you go along these paths. And that's what I meant by thinking about the path, when you think in sequences, then risk operates in a rather strange way. Okay, so just to, formally, what this way of thinking about value risk is, we sometimes call this the pre-committed value risk, because you're starting at a start state, you're privileging that state. You're saying, I'm evaluating risk from the perspective of this start state here, not worrying, and then I'm organizing all my calculations downstream to try to evaluate this risk, because that's what I care about. I'm committing at that time to what I'm going to do. And that's the risk that I think that I should be concerned with at that point. So we're privileging this start state. You might think that's a home or a nest or something like that. And that means we're then going to have to change our alpha values. It means we keep on reevaluating how risk averse or risk seeking we are according to this apparent gambler's fallacy. So if you're unlucky, that means that alpha increases. That means that when you've been unlucky, you're now going to afford to be a bit more risk neutral. And if you're lucky, that means you've already been lucky on this path. Better things have happened than you expected. And that means that alpha is now going to have to decrease. We're going to have to become more risk averse in the future. Because so that from the perspective of the start state, your total risk calculation is preserved. Alpha is 0 and 1 especially. They don't require any, by the time you get to alpha equals 1, you then stick there. You just average look at the mean outcome. And alpha is 0 means you only care about the worst possible outcome altogether. And again, you stick there. You're always just thinking about the worst outcome. There's no possible reevaluation after those points. So those 2 points are special in this instance. And you can either, in these cases, you can either sort of evaluate things by accumulating risk along paths, by accumulating returns along paths. You have a little history-dependent evaluation. Or what's more convenient is to do what I described, which is to sort of keep alpha along with you and then keep on revaluing alpha as you're lucky or unlucky in this way in order to do your calculations. So here's a simple random walk where we can see this process happening. So this is with only one lava pit, so it's a one-dimensional random walk. There's a lava pit here worth -10. There's a reward worth 2 here, reward worth 1 here. And then again, this shows this, you have a policy, you can try to move left or right and stay where you are. And again, you have, I think in this instance, a 10% chance of error in where you're going. You have a discount factor. So here, this says, imagine you have a completely uniform at random policy. You just go left and right and stay where you are equally often. This is the distribution of return, discounted returns. So that's that distribution of all the outcomes if you were to do this and worry about what your return looked like. That is that distribution. And so we can ask now about evaluating states, and then including a start state shown here under this distribution. And you ask what values do they have. So if you can see this, you can see there's like goes from red to green. So that the values from -10 to +10. And you can see that under the uniform policy, this going left and right equally often, then and staying where you are, the states towards the left are negative because you have this chance of entering the log of it. States on the right tend to be a bit positive because the reward is 1 before you get, and then because the discount factor takes you a while to get gobbled up by the log pit. So those are positive. That's true if you're risk neutral. So alpha is equal to 1. Just the average value of this, which you can see is from the start state here is just slightly positive, which I guess or slightly, I forget, maybe slightly negative, showed by here. What about if alpha's 0? What do you think the value's going to look like if alpha's 0? Everything's red. Will they be uniformly red?
Yeah, in every case,
so that's almost right. So you're absolutely right. Everything's red, but they're not quite uniformly red because. And so the reason why everything is red is because indeed, even though you're trying to, you're thinking about staying where you are or moving this. Really, you only ever put all your weight, just as you said, going left. But it still means that if you even if you start here and you're going left, it's still going to take you 9 time steps to get to the log. Whereas if you're here and you go left, you get to the log in 1 step. So you're exactly right. That is only the worst possible outcome that you care about, which means that you only, in fact, these these invisible thicker grey arrows show you what the risk-adjusted probability is, right? These ways that we adjust chance for risk. And so that then moves in this direction. And that's shown by the fact that these arrows are big. That's the boosting of these arrows. And if we look at other risk values, so 0.05, you can see that here, and again, we see this effective alpha. So maybe I'll show you the others. So what you can see here is that the effective alpha is clear here. Sorry. The effective alpha is clear here. So now, let's say you start at this location here. So you can either go right, you can either go right or left. If you go left, that's an unlucky direction because you're getting closer to the lava pit. And that means that then your risk aversion decreases, you get a little bit less, more risk neutral. That's alpha getting higher. That's the gambler's fallacy. If you're lucky, you go the other direction. Now you have your risk aversion increases, you go down this way. So you can see that as a function of your risk sensitivity, from maximally risk sensitive to risk neutral, you can see that the values go from being essentially all negative towards at least some of them being positive here, where these are good outcomes. So that's what happens if you just do evaluation. If you now get to do control, now you'd like to have an optimal policy where instead of where you now get to maximize your risk-adjusted values. So at alpha equals 1, so then you're risk neutral. This is just completely regular reinforcement learning. And so here you can see that the optimal policy is in fact under this circumstance to go left at the start state here, and you then try to stay where you are as reward is 2, and then in the end you're going to end up with the lava pit. But it turns out to be worth your while to do that because you have a high enough chance of staying, lasting there for a long time. If alpha is 0, the optimal policy makes no difference. This is the effect of learned helplessness. Because you always think the worst possible thing can happen will happen, just as the gentleman said. And so that means that because of the random stochasticity in this domain, because there's some chance of going left, if your alpha is 0, you'll just think, well, that is always what's going to happen. So it makes actually no difference whatsoever what I do here. I can't affect the outcome. And so, as I mentioned, learned helplessness is a phenomenon that people think of as being important in depression, where you think you lack control over the world. So here, it's not that you lack control over the world, but you're so worried about the nastiest things that can happen, and you lack control over those. So that's the thing those are the things you worry about. And then as we look at these intermediate values, remember I said that you have to start at, you do it relative to a start state. So this is we start at 0.3, risk sensitivity of 0.3 at this start state. You can see that these values, of course, are all better than these values. You're doing optimal control. But it turns out that if you're this risk averse to this degree, the correct thing to do at this stage is to try to go right to try and get this reward. instead of going left, which is what it does for risk neutral. So this is the way that risk neutrality or risk non-neutrality affects your choices. So if we come back to our lava pits, our pilot experiment in the lab, we can now show you I can now show you what the risk policy is like for different values of alpha. So for alpha equals, and shown by these colors arrows, so alpha equals 1, that means you're risk neutral. It's designed so it's just in this instance it's just risk neutral to take this path which takes you past all these lava pits. Here, if alpha is about 0.5, so yeah, you just care about the bottom 50% of the distribution, the average value in that, then you get this intermediate risk version, looks like this. And then if alpha is around 0.15, then that's the one that inspires you to go all the way around. So depending how risk averse you are, you will make different choices in this domain. We'd like to use this as a trials of TOS like this as a way of evaluating your nasty outcomes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So if we can evaluate a C-bar, the C-bar for so let's imagine we do policy iteration, right? So that says you give me a policy, and I return the C-bar values for all the actions for all the possible actions under that policy, right? So I can think like little Q values, and that says that, but they are risk-sensitive values instead of risk-neutral values. And then I say I'm going to choose at that state a new policy which chooses the best action under this risk-sensitive value function. So every action. So here, this is what these actions look like under this degree of risk sensitivity. So you can see what the stakes are like. So then you think, okay, well, now, how would I change my behavior if I could at this particular risk value? Would I change, instead of making it be 50, a third, going left, right, and down, I'll say, well, if I look at the value of going right, maybe that's better than going left, for instance. And then in that, which try to stay where you are in this reward, which will certainly have a higher value. I would give you a new policy, and then I reevaluate that policy, and then say, under this policy, what's my new risk value? So I just do regular dynamic programming, except that if you know about it, the Bellman equation, so the equation that dynamic programming satisfies, which is like the consistency condition, just says I want my values that I'm thinking about to be risk sensitive values rather than risk neutral values. And then I can compute the same thing the same way. It's a bit more complicated to do the computations because of this reweighting, this psi-based reweighting shown by these arrows here. But it's underlying, it's essentially the same idea. So just keep on improving sequentially. Yeah. So this instance, it actually makes no difference. So for the alpha is 0, just as John said, because your actions are not perfect, which means that you try to go left. Let's say you try to go right, you still have a I think 5% chance of going left, or maybe a third percent, or 3 and a third percent chance of going left. So if alpha is 0, you only care about the worst possible outcome. So you try to go right, the worst outcome is going left. Try to stay where you are, worst outcome is going left. Try to go left, right, worst outcome is going left. So you only worry about going left. And that's the example of that. So here, I just happen to show you stay where you are. It makes absolutely no difference as far as that's concerned. And that's why you in your mind you lack control. There's another question. Yeah.
Simulation scale that offline when this gravitates towards the rest of that simulation gravitates towards
so okay, so there's a couple things to unpack. So here I did this in a model-based way because I have a model of the world and I do model-based planning, sort of offline planning process where I have a model and I think about this there. So I can just work out ahead of time what the optimal policy is. Second thing is if you do online, like regular online reporting, you can do you can imagine doing a sort of distributional reinforcement where you learn these distributions out, and then you can use those distributions in different ways to essentially think about doing planning in this risk averse way. So you can still do risk averse planning in an online way as well. But the third thing is, and it comes back to the part of it, which is this interaction between exploration and exploitation. We said that now exploitation is the risk-sensitive exploitation, and now exploration is how do you explore in a risk-sensitive way. And of course, now you have a different sort of problem, which is that it's like, imagine you're exploring a world, you don't know if there might be, you might step on that bit of the floor, maybe there's a trapdoor, I think it's stuff up into bowels of the university. Could be. No problem. Alpha is 0, then that's why I like that. So risk-sensitive exploration is very good. And so we've actually done some work with one of my another research assistant at Peril, done some work looking at essentially trying to model the degrees of timidity of different mice. I have charts I've chosen some slides for that. Yeah. And we put it in the context of risk-sensitive exploration. And that's a very difficult problem because if you have the possibility, certainly for us, you know, we are, again, it's not, we can generate all sorts of nasty possibilities like the trapdoor here without any difficulty. So we have to worry about that. So there's three things you know, to be honest. What's that? Adrenaline. Oh, adrenaline.
So, but then wouldn't alpha higher than what the switches that is in that scenario in alpha 1?
Yeah. So what? So formally, I think what you're imagining doing is looking instead of the lower tail of the distribution, you're thinking about looking at the upper tail of the distribution. Right? And so you can. So sometimes people think of alpha as going from -1 to 1. You can have negative values of alpha thinking of the upper tail and positive values of alpha thinking of the lower tail or vice versa. So that's totally possible to do. You can also imagine sort of editing other bits of the distribution. You have middle bits of the distribution. So you're quite right. You might think about risk seeking, and in fact, insurance people are sort of miserabilists, and so in fact they tend to think about they always tend to think about the negative returns or positive returns, and so they are normally thinking about the upper tail of minus returns, whereas we're thinking about the lower tail of plus returns, which is essentially the same. So you're quite right. You can be risk seeking as well. And then I don't know about adrenaline in that context, but certainly there are people who are risk seeking, and there are various scales in psychiatry to think about people who are overly risk seeking in those cases, and of course that is not a great outcome either in many cases. Yeah. Is that?
Our alpha values in the next slide.
So we didn't compute the alpha values. We said let's look at optimal control for different alpha values. And so here, this is just the optimal control for alpha is 1. This is the optimal control for alpha is whatever it is, alpha is 1.5 and so forth. And we designed, Chris and Yannick designed this domain in such a way that we could distinguish different degrees of risk aversion in our subjects because we were interested. So we designed it to tempt different people with different risk sensitivities in this way, so we can elicit what their risk sensitivity was. And so, you know, as I said, we don't really get to choose what the sensitivity is. I'll show you one result a little bit later about what people do with alpha. But yeah, it's just by design. Let's not get the issue about exploration that we were talking about before, right? So optimism in the face of uncertainty is usually what justifies exploration. In the sense you think there's something I don't know, and it's possible if I discover it, then I can exploit it in the future, and therefore I have a benefit to me of exploring this piece of information. Now here, so that's a case of epistemic uncertainty. Here, I've only looked at what's called aleatoric uncertainty, which is this. It says here, there's no exploration. I've given you the whole map. You're just choosing where you do it. So the aleatoric uncertainty is just the sort of irreducible uncertainty of the fact that you have a 12.5% chance of moving in the wrong direction. So when you think about epistemic uncertainty, the uncertainty that you can actually benefit from if you find out that it's good, we're then in the case of exploration, which is just the answer I was giving to the question we asked before. And again, so the same thing happens in epistemic uncertainty, that it's still worth your while might be worth your while to explore that it could be a good idea for you to stand in the environment, but maybe better, right? Even though there's a job on actually I'm going to try to. If I discover I can stand here and see, then I don't know why I do it again in the future. So I still have this epistemic value, which is an optimism based on uncertainty, but my optimism is tempered the fact that there's also a risk aversion associated with that. And now that same uncertainty that can generate positive things can also generate negative things. And so if I'm risk neutral, then I worry less about those negative things. If I'm risk averse, then I worry a lot more about those negative things. If I'm hyper risk averse, the alpha is 0, then I only worry about it's only the negative things, the really nastiest things that I expect to happen. So we need to have both, and that's relates to the exploration of the system. Yeah.
It's quite well back now, but can you maybe elaborate a bit on why this risk accumulation setting is more practically relevant in the psychiatric sense than just the one-step decision task?
Okay, so I think that the one-step decision tasks are extremely convenient for us as experimenters to try and look at, to try and do immediate experiments. But in our lives, we don't live in one-step decision-making tasks, right? We commit to going to graduate school, and 4 years later we both have that degree, right? So we are constantly making choices which play out over the whole sequence of actions. So in fact, there's simply no point whatsoever in thinking from a real world point of view about one-step decisions. We essentially never make them, almost never make them one-step decisions. We only make them as psychologists when it's convenient for us to look at. So that means that sometimes it doesn't matter, right? Sometimes maybe you can elicit enough about your risk aversion by looking only at these one-step decisions. But there are different ways of evaluating. There's another way I'll tell you about in a minute of evaluating risk along these paths. And so if you don't look at risk along paths, then you're never going to see it, right? And so in reality, if you want to move towards something that's a bit more realistic, we're going to have to think about sequences of choices. And then the way that people worry about that becomes really important. So that's the sort of boring answer in a way.
So how far, like the participants would know the entire map to the world.
Yeah.
Isn't it then also kind of one shot decision making for once deciding where to go? Really like to go somewhere not knowing what the next map will be.
So this again relates to the same point about exploration. So even though you see the whole domain, so that's the way it was presented, it's exactly like this. So you choose which direction to go. You're still having to make multiple choices along the way. So when we're looking at the path that you're evaluating, you have to evaluate a path based on the whole sequence. So it's like when I show you this return here, this is the return, the long run return that you think about, right? So that is a consequence of this policy, that is the return of this location. But that return comes from all these sequential choices you're making along the way. So if you want to evaluate that return like that correctly, that's what leads to these choices here. So although it's a one-step choice, the step although my finger is being a one-step choice, am I going down this way or going down this way? In fact, it's not that, because of course, in fact, I blow you off course with your 12.5% probability. And so then you have to decide, well, now if I get blown off course, that happens here, right? This guy presumably was going upwards, got blown off course this way. Now what does he do after that? So in fact, even in this case, there are decisions to make. So in reality, even this is a case. Now, the case that you don't know what happens, then we're back to epistemic uncertainty, right? And so then we still have to do planning in that case too. And that's an interesting and rich problem. But the principles of that problem are the same as the principles here. It's just the calculations of that are much more. Yeah. That's a very good question. I'm sure that will come up a lot in the course of this summer school, which is to what extent can we use sort of optimizing theories like this one here to account for behavior when you actually see it? And what are people actually thinking about when they go this, how they go about it? So in defense of these optimization theories, one is it's nice to know what, given a policy that you actually have, what does it actually achieve? Right? So what does that, we only know that we understand what's that characteristic? It then said, and then you could start to ask, well, how would you have gotten the policy like almost like a meta learning? Maybe. So where you might have experienced other sorts of problems before, and you had some spidey sense intuition, network, which is essentially a computer that thought about, will I have this sort of, roughly speaking, how much risk do I think? So I think that we have like a sort of justified way of understanding what this is like. And then you have a recognition problem, so I see this problem. how do I go about making choices? And some of that will be fast calculations. We'll have a mix of those sort of fast calculations. And some of it will be what we think of as being sort of pre-planned recognition of those policies that you apply to these circumstances. And then, if you get caught by the algorithm, I'm just going to change your policy, and then that will then be us. So it's really interesting to understand that relationship between the calculations you can do online and the calculations you can do offline. And again, I won't have time to talk about it, but if you think about replay, that's the sort of thing when you think about some offline calculations that you can do to make choices appropriate to your actual degree of risk, your true degree of risk aversion. Okay, so let's be on time. Just to say that, so Yannick and Chris ran a whole bunch more alarm pits. So here's another problem here. So here's another one where the start is here, the goal is here. You have this very risky, another risky path, a neutral path. This path is one alarm pit, and then here's the hyper risk averse path here. And again, you can see that these are three subjects who, over a whole sequence of domains, we inferred their alpha values to be the green subject is pretty risk neutral. This one is more risk averse and more risk averse still. And you can see that in a different domain, the same behavior comes up, but with a different set of choices. So again, the green guy goes very close to the lower pits, the orange guy, the yellow guy goes a bit further away, and the blue one goes a bit further away too. There's something relatively speaking consistent about the choices that these subjects are making. So we gave them 30 domains. And what this shows is the log likelihood of their choices. So here as a function of alpha. So here this is listed by subjects from the most risk averse subject to the most risk neutral subject. And this says if we imagine all their choices under a particular degree of risk aversion, let's say 1.5, how likely are those choices? So if you're a risk averse subject, that means you're down here. Your choices are more likely under low values of alpha. If you're a risk neutral subject, your choices are more likely under a high value of alpha. We didn't look at this instance at the risk people who are actually risk seeking. And so you can see that from the you can't see it very clearly on this plot, but we've sorted the subjects by essentially their mean degree of risk, inferred risk aversion. So you can see that they vary along this line. So you could do it if you could see it clearly. But for instance, related to the question that was just asked, we could also, what Yannick also did, was to look at how stable are people's degrees of risk aversion. So what this shows is how much did they change alpha from one trial to the next, according to whether they got to the goal correctly, or whether they got gobbled up by the log on a trial. So what you can see is the blue distribution shows what happens on trial, on the map n. If on map n minus 1, you got to the goal, and the answer is you don't really change alpha very much at all. But if you got gobbled up by the lava pit on trial n minus 1, then your alpha, you can see that the red distribution, on average decreases by like 0.1, 0.15 or something. So we're still looking at this in the early days of this experiment. So that suggests that people are revaluing their risk associated with what actually happens on the domain. That relates, I think, to the answer to the question to the previous question. Yeah. So this is looking at, you can estimate alpha based on a single trial. Of course, you get a noisy estimate depending on how long it lasts. So if you get gobbled up with a lava pit on the first go, then you don't find anything. So it's hard to estimate, and that's why these distributions are quite broad. And we designed the domain, we designed these maps in order to try and optimize the way that we would estimate the information we could get about alpha from their behavior. And of course, there's degrees of noisiness here, and so we need to dig into this more. So this is rather preliminary data, but I think that at least there's some evidence that we can estimate something about it on these cases. And of course, this makes the assumption that alpha is constant across all 30 maps, which clearly is not true, right? So there are some problems already with our own analyses that we need to look at. Yeah. Yeah, so we had a discount factor of 0.9, which means that you can have and that's to encourage people to make short paths, right? So we didn't, so there's a cost to subjects of going, very far around, because it means that the value they get actually is low. So that's again, that's a bit arbitrary. That's what our choices is. But people bring their own discount factors to the pie, right? So in fact, people don't tend to do the sort of exponential discounting I talked about. So that could interact in a complicated way potentially without the discount factor that we impose on this cost. And we could instead have charged them minus 0.1 for a move. There are various ways we could have operationalized this. But as I said, it's kind of early days for looking at what could happen. Yeah.
And I also see all of this and hands on thinking about limitation. Humans naturally are taking shortcuts, even though it makes no sense for the objective to be taught. But still, people are impatient and you do this, take risky steps. Even I'm a risk-averse person, but still often I'm impatient and you really dumb things and take risks just because I'm impatient. What's your intuition? Does patience play any?
So formally, it's a link between the cost of delay, like the cost of time, and then the cost of the risk that you're taking by trying to avoid that, by being impatient, by taking that, two things. First of all, let's think about this. So if I change gamma, if I change this gamma to make you more patient, then of course it's more optimal to take paths which go further and further away. So your degree of impatience, which we here could operationalize by gamma in this instance, makes you more risk-seeking because the value of the outcome changes. So it looks like you'll be more risk-seeking in this context because because discounting makes it more expensive to be slow, essentially. And here, these domains are designed such that you get to be faster with fewer cases. But you can, so that's just a function of the way these domains work. So you might be very risk averse, but also extremely impatient, and that means that then in certain domains you can then elicit, like thank you for telling me I can now sell you an appropriate used car, accordingly, because we can then take advantage of these various factors in your case. Now, of course, one trouble with this is that the way that we operationalize time here could be different from the way that you operationalize time. That's the gamma factor. And another trouble is that there are other factors that make you impatient other than to do with risk. So, for instance, we think of something which we tend to call Pavlovian misbehavior. So, for instance, what you see is that people, let's say somebody on a diet, and they go past a bakery, with the lovely smell of Black Forest gâteau wafting out of the door, right? So people, even if they're on a diet, will have a tendency to get sort of sucked in and find themselves eating this Black Forest gâteau, even though they're on a diet, and they regret it afterwards, right? So that's another sort of impatience that comes. So I don't think that's anything to do with risk. But of course, now if you know that fact about yourself, that you get sucked in by the Black Forest gâteau, you might design a path to work that takes you very far from any wafting smells of lovely fruitcakes, right? And so you can then you're fighting your impatience with some cognitive control. So I think that's a bit different from this sort of risk. Although of course the risk that you defect on your diet is something that your model-based system can happily evaluate as you choose between paths to work, because your policy mechanism is failing, right? It wants to just go straight past the bakery, it fails to do so. The transit.
But still, I think it's a feature because we always try to take some shortcuts or try to find shortcuts.
Well, wanting to find shortcuts and wanting to take shortcuts are different. So sure, you want to find a shortcut, provided that shortcut is safe and gives you the same reward or more reward. You don't want to find that shortcut. You may not want to find that shortcut if that shortcut is associated with a large amount of risk. So you have an incentive to do it, but here the cost of doing so is something which may be big or may be small. So a shortcut is fine. We try to optimize it. Here we try to optimize our behavior. But the cost of that optimization, if the cost of that optimization is that you then are taking a risk. So you say the shortest thing I can do is walk down the middle of the street. And I just hope if I do it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe the cars are going slow enough, that's not a hit. That's probably not a shortcut you're willing to take, right? So there are some shortcuts you won't take because of the risk. So you're evaluating the shortcuts against the cost of the risk, and that's exactly what this should evaluate.
Thank you.
So this may be like a little bit of hypothetical, but I'm wondering about the distributions of what's the punishment represented. Like out of it's about 10 points goal at the end, it's not quite what it's but sort of like my intuition would be is that how it works with humans with some part of the deal? So I can imagine that the distribution which a person with extreme phobia or more like highly skewed. So like it think that like black swans of extremely unpleasant events would be likely than the realistic with extremely small probability that we have.
absolutely. And indeed, and it's what Dominic back where I think about what do you do in that circumstance, where basically you always think about essentially something that amounts to death versus any. So you think, well, if there's any probability of dying doing this action, then it overcomes any possible normal return that I can get. And indeed, I think in extreme pathophysiology, that's what stops you. What are you going to do? Stay at home, right? Because anytime you go outside the home, you're risking one over, you risk somebody attacking, whatever. And in the home, you risk, like there being the roof falling on your head, right? So that's why you can imagine extreme anxiety, that you really are, that you're looking at these really unpleasant events, possibly unpleasant events, which have really low probabilities. But if your alpha is near to zero, those low probabilities nevertheless are dominating your thinking. And then you might think, well, I'm going to try and plan to avoid those. Well, how can I make life safe? How can I make life safe for myself? Well, of course, there are things you can do inside to make life safe for yourself, so you can protect things. But as soon as you depend on other people or other things in the outside world, then your ability to control that environment has gone away. And that's the learned helplessness that comes along with that. And indeed, anxiety and depression are very co-morbid. I think that's probably one of the underlying issues that comes up with that from an anxiety point of view, is that you think, well, there's just no opportunity that I can afford to exploit in the world. So it's a very tough issue for us. Yeah.
I have another question, but
Okay, so I should say that this is not based on this work is not based on patients at all. We're just taking people on the internet, so far it's just online. People in the lab do the internet. I think we'd like to use it to design psychiatric instruments, so tasks that you can give to psychiatric patients. And as you probably know, in psychiatry, there's this notion of like state versus trait issues. So trait issues are something which is sort of intrinsic to the self. And then, but even if you're trait anxious, your state of anxiety may fluctuate over time. Or if you're trait depressed, then your actual degree of depression is something which fluctuates in various ways. So here, we certainly imagine this to be this would be a state-like measure. How anxious am I feeling now? And that may not be a trait-like measure itself. And there are questionnaires try to elicit. So most in psychiatry, people are not using experiments. They're typically just asking questions about what happens, what you feel about different events. And there are questionnaires which try to elicit state anxiety and trait anxiety separately, and you can argue about whether they do a good job of that. So these mechanisms so far are only interested, as I say, only capable of really looking at state anxiety. So trait anxiety, we want to find out as being more like a way, like almost like a context-dependent reaction to a circumstance. You say, if you're trait anxious, that means that when something happens of a particular sort, maybe that changes your degree of state anxiety. So really the change in alpha, and we didn't design this sort of for this at all, but things like the change in alpha as a consequence of outcomes, we think that in the end, something like that, and we have no data about this at all, is more like the thing that you would think of as a trait having an effect, as opposed to a state. Your state changes in a way, and that's the trait. So I think probably psychiatry as a whole is trying to make sense of these issues, and they're sort of struggling. I'm running out a bit of time because I know you will have to go off to the men's hall to get lunch. So let me hop to I want to say a word about risk avoidant planning, and then I'll just conclude. So what I've told you about is online sort of model-based reinforcement. In fact, the way we do this, I think we use Monte Carlo tree search, so a number of different ways you do the calculations we talked about. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest at the moment to think about, well, what can we and other animals do offline in order to do some sort of planning for the circumstances that we experience. And there's this phenomenon that's been well known for decades about this coordinated hippocampal replay, where you can see the hippocampus because you can record play cells. The hippocampus is one of the has play cells, which are cells which fire when the animal's in a particular cogenous environment. And what's nice about that is you can record enough of them, you get a sense of where the animal is thinking it is in the environment because you can decode it. And what you see is that when the animal is not behaving in the environment, but they're sitting quietly, grooming or eating or indeed asleep, you can see a replay of the same patterns of activity that you would see when the animal is actually awake. You might wonder, well, what is that doing? Why is it getting that replay? What's that process doing, essentially? There's evidence of that in both rodents and humans. And the reinforcement learning literature has been interested in this actually for a long time. So Rich Sutton suggested an algorithm called Dayan, where he argued that offline, so online you build a model of the world, and offline you would then essentially plan to do exploration. It's a way of thinking about exploration. So you can think, well, maybe some part of the world has changed, and so I now need to plan to go and see if it's changed, because if it has changed, then maybe I can exploit it in the future. That's the optimism in the face of uncertainty. There's a paper then by Marcelo Matter and Nathaniel Dorr, who argued that for this is an exact model of what hippocampal replay is achieving. So when you're playing the hippocampus, in fact, what it's doing is essentially taking your current model of the world, things you found out about the world, and then using that to train a policy which you can use quickly when you're faced with the choice of the world. So instead of having to do the complicated planning that you were complaining about correctly, you can essentially use these offline processes to give you a fast online mechanism of control, which nevertheless reflects all the information you have about the domain, such that you can then make good choices with that. So what we were interested in so what Matter and Dorr said, is that when you choose to do this update, how should you choose which state to replay? And what they were trying to have a theory of why an animal might replay one event versus another event. We go for the same thing in humans. And they argued that you should that there are sort of two factors which actually interact in a multiplicative way. A gain factor, which says how much, if I were to replay at this location, how much would it change my policy? And a need factor, which says how frequently am I likely to be at that location anyway, that makes it worth my while changing my value. You multiply those two things together, and that tells you the priority order for those items. And what we were interested in doing was saying, well, what happens if you have, if you do risk avoidant planning? Where would it mean that you would be doing your planning about? We tried to use this to think about rumination, where like at least one aspect of rumination. So what this shows is that in this simple random walk domain that we had before, here with this log of it, imagine you just know the log of it, you know the rules of the domain. You haven't got a right plan, you've got the correct plan for what to do. You know the rules of the domain, this is worth -10, plus 2, and plus 1. And then if alpha is 1, you're risk neutral. You could ask, well, which states would I be thinking about in this domain, and what order, which replay events do I have? So you can see that if you're risk neutral, you spend your time essentially planning backwards from the, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4, this numbers tell the order of replay events optimized by Matter and Dorr. And you can see that you essentially work out an optimal plan to get to this location, and then like a reasonable optimal plan to get to that location. This is also known as prioritized sweeping from Andrew Moore in the 90s. But if you are risk averse, now it turns out you spend a lot of your time worrying about, well, what to do. And you're actually here, this is where you start, this degree of risk aversion, the 0.3 value that we had before. Then you can see that you spend a lot of your time worrying about, in fact, what to do at different levels of risk aversion. You'll keep on worrying constantly about what to do if you're close to the lava pit. And so you can imagine you're thinking, well, now what would I do if I were close to the lava pit? What should I do? You're not spending very much time thinking about the things you're going to lead to your optimal policy at all. As you're getting more risk averse, that gets even worse. And you spend a lot of time worrying about high degrees of risk aversion that you're going to get there. And then if we do maybe I'll just show this domain here. This is another, I didn't have a chance to talk about, there's another sort of evaluation along sequences, but which is even more extreme in this case. And here, there's a start state, there's a single goal, and there's this log of it. And this way of doing it is similar to using log, the details don't really matter. But again, here, you see, if you prioritize in a risk neutral way, you just spend one time thinking, well, how do I avoid it? If I were close to the log, what should I do? And the rest of the time, you work out essentially what amounts to an optimal path backwards from the goal to from the reward is 1 to the start state. But if you prioritize based on the 10%, so you're right around the bottom 10% distribution, you can see that you spend all your time worrying about how to avoid the log, and none of your time worrying about that. This is an example of how you'll skew your degree of what you're thinking about in this sort of context. Okay, so back to our, just the last slide, back to our cognitive psychiatry. So, why would some people's behavior, like what individual differences might you see? Well, from the wrong problem perspective, you can imagine that we have this optimal dysfunction, right? So remember, the wrong problem is you're trying to solve, you have the right mechanism to solve things, but the problem you're solving is somehow a problem different from what you or society might like. And so here, you can imagine you have this dysfunctional avoidance and rumination by having two values, a really low value of alpha, like near to 1, near to 0, you get this learned helplessness in the extreme. And that's the action indifference and learned helplessness. We can imagine how much you should spend doing meta control. So how much rumination you should do. Like do you have a threshold for how much improvement you do in this rumination case? And again, you can spend, if you have a low threshold for that, you spend a lot of time worrying about places that other people would not worry about at all. And then for humans, we're smart, right? We can have, we live in complicated domains, and there's always another catastrophe around the corner. So imagine you're trying to make a cup of tea, and you pour the boiling water on your toe, and then on your way out of your house, you trip over the stairs and fall down, and then when you get to the bottom, you get run over by a car, you get to the hospital, you get MRSA. We can design ever more complicated, unpleasant things that can happen to you. And if you're risk averse, these are low probability events. You have a hard time estimating the probability of, but nevertheless, you're worried about them. You can be really worried. And then this issue about epistemic uncertainty comes up too, this exploration exploitation trade-off. So you won't explore if you're very risk averse. From a wrong solution point of view, you could imagine that you're trying to update. Imagine this replay mechanism. You're trying to do this planning, but of course you'll keep on thinking about all these nasty things that might happen. You can worry that log of things there, the log of things there. And you can imagine that, that there's a sort of one of these pieces of Pavlovian misbehavior, or the opposite of thing that takes you into the Black Forest Ghetto. It's something that says as soon as you start thinking about logarithms, you think, I'm not going to think about this. I can't bear to think about these logarithms. And so you never essentially consummate the change to your policy that would happen with that replay. And that means in the same way that because you essentially edit out that piece of learning you would need to do. And that means you've never fixed the problem in the environment. So now you have to keep on going back to the same, you keep on ruminating around the same thing again and again. And we've argued that there's aspects of serotonin in the book that we talk about. And then you can also imagine that maybe you have this PC bar, but you don't adjust correctly for being lucky or when you're being unlucky. Right? So you think, I'm now unlucky, I should now become more risk neutral. But maybe you don't adjust correctly for that. So you just become endlessly more risk averse. Then in terms of a wrong environment, so the thing where where the environment's gone wrong, one thing you can imagine is that that if the way that you represent the environment, so essentially governs the way you generate, so you put the representations take states, they put them together and say that you expect something you learn about one state, you also learn about the other state. That's really important because we can't learn about every state, too many states, and we'd like to understand that generalization structure. Again, something I'm sure you'll come talk about in the rest of this meeting. But if you have representations which have this property, now you have this infection, essentially, where if you're really worried about low probability events where nasty things can happen, now that something can happen in one state but doesn't happen in other states, can now infect that first state, which means that then now your planning is going to be adjusted to the whole collection of things that can happen in this sort of macro state, which includes nasty stuff. So if you overgeneralize the way you represent the world, which you have to do in many cases, or you have to generalize it to represent the world, then this generalization can infect states in a way that makes life difficult. Okay, that's all there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter, for the fantastic talk. Are there any more questions? I think we can have maybe 3 more questions and go for some 1 hour break. Do you want the slide to be shared?
See?
Will the slide be shared?
Yes, I'll give them to Toby.
And also the recordings, to make that available.
Risk of avoiding lunch is too high.
I was just thinking about how much classical psychiatry revolves around of child and I was just curious if there is a big technique different how you design something so simple for one child for
Okay, so as I mentioned, psychiatry, so traditional psychiatry doesn't use even one-shot designs. They don't use, typically have not used cognitive tasks. There are a few tasks that people use, like the Bloom adaptive risk task, which my students work on. But mostly, psychiatry works on the basis of, to a large extent, on questionnaires, talking. Right? You try to work out what somebody's feeling, what they're experiencing, what events have happened in their lives, what things they've done. And so you're not, traditional psychiatry does not use these sorts of cognitive tasks. Cognitive psychiatry, as a movement, is trying to think about, can we use some of these tasks that people use to index different components of cognition, essentially, to try and both neural substrates and cognition itself, to try and understand more about the underlying basis of what goes wrong in psychiatry. So that's a movement which is struggling to come to be right, as a nascent movement. And that is indeed extremely interested in designing tasks of different sorts. And we've been involved in many such tasks, and some of them involve these one-shot cases, and some of them involve these multi-shot cases too. So the question for that is, well, what mechanisms are we trying to interrogate in the head that then relate to the problems that people experience in their real life, right? To what extent do we get reliable measures that relate to their, to things that we can predict about their prognosis? And the answer we don't know yet, right? Because this project is so happy extremely well. So hopefully, the simpler we can be, the better. But of course, the simple tasks are not very engaging tasks, right? And also, many instances, you have to have sequential interactions. So, for instance, a lot of the work we do as well is to think about interactions between individuals, where I might be playing a game, like an economic game with you, for instance, and I'm interested in how I develop trust with you. And you can't do those. And you can do some things with those in one shot, like these things like ultimate one shot or ultimate game indicator. But most of what happens in interactions evolves over sequences of interactions. And where things go wrong and right in those cases, we are forced to design tasks that will meet that complexity. And so we don't really have an option if we're trying to interrogate things which are affected by that. We would love not to, because they could do a single task and then it'd be fast and over. But I don't think we can guarantee to do that. So that's why we have to be ecumenical about our willingness to look at more complex tasks like these ones. Yeah.
So what you talk about here is basically all planned, right? But obviously there is this organization right, which kind of
leads to
different directions possible. Do you have any idea of how this model phase, that model freedom, the brain interacts, and when we use which stream? Are they represented separately or combined?
Okay, great questions. So, and sort of bigger answers than probably have time for, but just very quickly. So we definitely have, I think it's highly likely we have methods of both model-based and model-free and planning and learning. And both of them will be quite sophisticated. So in model-free learning, we have distributional model-free learning, where you can learn about distributed outcomes, for instance. And we know there's some evidence that doping cells show that TD errors like the work from people like Will Dabney and now you should. The replay mechanisms I talked about here are actually ways, it's just one of a number of ways of interacting between model-based and model-free. Because here you have a model of the world and it's training a model, so a model-based system generates experience, notional virtual experience, which then trains the model-free system, which means that you start off with something where you can see flexible behavior. That flexible behavior is actually produced by a model-free system, but that has been trained offline by a model-based system. So it's a nice case where the brain has a capacity to generate a sort of better quality control in a fast way, which is what it needs. And I think in the case of risk, if you think about animals in an environment where there's actually predation risk, for instance, then you have there's evidence that animals will do some of this offline planning. You're planning, what would I do? What would I do if predator comes from here? I want to be able to know already where I should go. And you can see that animals are actually, sometimes, for instance, tracking places they can run off to. They've learned a policy which allows them to do that. So there are many ways that model-based and model-free systems interact in this way. And once you can have these, then it means that finding a very clean experiment starts to be much harder because, of course, you can't guarantee that. You have to try and stop some of those interactions happening, which people have done. You can do things like, so I make you do a planning task and make you do it whilst you put your hand in a bucket of ice cold water called the cold pressure test. that suppresses your ability to do planning for various interesting reasons. And so therefore you get choices that are more model free. So there are things that we can do as experimentalists, but it means that the clean distinction that we can think of from a computation point of view gets a bit